my research focuses on education for some of the most marginalized children in the world, especially those who are affected by extreme poverty and those who live in situations of armed conflict. We know that armed conflict has really skyrocketed in the past several years, and the number of children living as refugees in exile has increased significantly. We see examples of that in the conflict in Syria, and increased conflict in Iraq, in Somalia, in the Central African Republic. And one of the particular areas of my research is focused on refugee education. We know that of refugee populations, a vast majority of refugees are children. And so the issues related to their education are quite significant. As I mentioned before, my particular focus has been thinking about how quality education matters for children who are living in exile, particularly refugee children. There are three dimensions of an approach to quality education that I've been focused on. One is related to policies that influence the kind of education that children receive. The second is related to the teaching and learning that goes on in classrooms, what pedagogy looks like, what the curriculum is. And the third is focused on relationships, the kind of daily interactions between teachers and children and among children that we know matter greatly for teaching and for learning. In terms of policy, one of my focuses has been on looking at the education strategy of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. This is a 4-year strategy that really attempts to push the focus from access to education towards quality education. And the research that I did in doing a state of the field review on refugee education helped to shape the parameters for this strategy. One of the focuses of the strategy has been on integrating refugees within national systems where that's appropriate and where refugee communities desire that. And this has been a major shift for UNHCR and for work in humanitarian emergency kinds of situations. The thought is always that emergency situations are short-lived and that refugees will want to go home and be able to go home within a few short years. The reality is actually something quite different, that most conflicts are protracted in nature and that a child who lives in displacement will live in displacement for 20 years. In this kind of a situation, thinking about how to integrate children within national systems becomes important for a number of reasons. And my research has really focused on what the influences of that integration are on children's sense of belonging to a community, on the language of instruction and how they're able to cope with a new system, and on the quality of teaching. Being integrated within a national system allows refugee children to access a national education system and a teacher training system that is already established, and where the teachers do have training in curriculum and pedagogy in order to meet their needs. Without integrating within national systems, refugee teachers are often left without training, and so the quality of education within classrooms for refugees suffers. A second issue related to that is the idea of social inclusion and a sense of belonging, particularly in these protracted situations where refugees will live in exile for many, many years. Finding a place that has some stability, a school that can lend that sense of continuity and certainty to a life that otherwise is in flux becomes tremendously important for refugee children in their sense of belonging and in their feeling of having a community to which they can identify. Needless to say, there are challenges to this kind of integration, and not every individual or community wishes for that integration within national systems. Some of the work that we've been doing in Egypt right now with Syrian refugees shows that Syrian families within Egypt do not wish to integrate within the Egyptian national system. It's been quite the opposite with refugee families from Democratic Republic of Congo, with which I've done long-term research, integrating within Uganda and really finding that exposure to English as a language of instruction and the stability of a Ugandan national school system has great benefits and great appeal for refugee families. So I see in the policy this opening for integration within national systems where it is appropriate, and see in practice this very clear reality of children and families desiring different approaches to policy depending on the particular context in which they live. The third element is related to relationships. And one of the particularly innovative and promising approaches to education in conflict settings that I've found is related to transnational relationships. Not only, so in refugee situations, what we're finding is that often refugee students, particularly high school students, have connections with students and mentors in other parts of the world via their online connections. The Somali students who I've been working with in Dadaab refugee camps in northern Kenya are connected to Somalis living in Toronto, for example, who were their teachers in the Dadaab refugee camps and then were resettled to Canada. Those kind of ongoing mentoring connections, the students describe playing a key role in supporting them in succeeding through secondary school and into higher education in their exile in Kenya. The potential for these relationships is something that I continue to explore, looking at the way that refugees from countries like Afghanistan, South Sudan, Haiti, and Zimbabwe are involved in rebuilding education systems in their countries of origin, thinking about approaches to teacher training, thinking about curriculum design, thinking about system-wide work on rebuilding these education systems after conflict. The number of refugees has reached its highest level now since the end of World War II. We're really in a particular moment where thinking about the education of refugee children is not only something that happens within very particular countries and regions, but which really is a global issue. We see the number of Syrian refugees in neighboring countries reaching levels that are really unprecedented in terms of a country hosting refugees. We know that globally, most refugees live in neighboring countries. They're not resettled to the United States, to Canada, to Australia. And we see countries like Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, addressing influxes of Syrian refugees within education systems in ways that I think is quite unimaginable to people in other parts of the world. If you were to think about your own child's classroom, all of a sudden from one year to the next, shifting so dramatically as to include half of the class from another country coming as refugees with very little economic means within that country and very vast amounts of uncertainty about what their future would be. We also see conflicts erupting in other parts of the world. We see conflict in Ukraine. We see conflict in Central African Republic. We see long, protracted conflicts in Democratic Republic of Congo, in Somalia. And even though there are glimpses of peace and glimpses of countries really on the road to rebuilding, many children from these countries remain in exile and don't have the ability to imagine themselves going home, given the political situation and given the lack of educational opportunities in their home countries. And so thinking about the kind of education that children do receive in exile and imagining how it can be borderless in important ways allows those children then to imagine a future that could be returning to their home country of Somalia, staying in exile in Kenya, or being more mobile and being resettled or finding opportunities for themselves in other parts of the world.